e abbiamo la presenza di studiosi di varia età, varia formazione. Insomma, abbiamo qualche cosa che assomiglia molto al melting pot europeo che si è creato proprio a partire dalla caduta del muro. Questo progetto in effetti ha a che fare con la caduta del muro e il superamento di tutti i muri, breaching the walls, in questo melting pot europeo che si è creato con la caduta del muro, dicevo, e che continua con fatica, ma continua a funzionare e a produrre l'uomo nuovo che ci aspettiamo, cioè il cittadino europeo. La Fondazione Gramsci è orgogliosa di avere pensato, organizzato insieme ad altri questo progetto e crede fermamente nei valori che vi sono sottesi, e cioè nel diffondersi della democrazia e del pensiero comune della democrazia in tutta Europa. E crede nella metodologia che è stata adottata, che è una sorta di incrocio fra pensiero storiografico alto e la ricerca e la attivazione e la riattivazione della memoria individuale, in modo tale che questo grande evento epocale, cioè appunto la caduta del muro, la fine dei regimi autoritari comunisti nell'Europa orientale, questo grande evento abbia la risonanza che ebbe e continua ad averla attraverso sia la storiografia sia la memoria dei singoli che vengono sollecitati a ricordare ciò che per essi è stato e ciò che per essi è stato quell'evento, e a misurare le speranze e le grandi illusioni che si sono create allora con i risultati del presente. Dunque una forma di lavoro scientifico interdisciplinare e interconnesso fra il livello alto e il livello popolare, una forma di lavoro che è molto nelle corde intellettuali e metodologiche della Fondazione Gramsci Emilia-Romagna, intorno alla quale si sono riunite istituzioni di tutta Europa orientale e occidentale, una forma di lavoro che qui presenta alcuni dei propri risultati con la consapevolezza che si sarebbe potuto fare di più, molto si è fatto, si sarebbe potuto fare di più se non fossimo stati interrotti dalla sciagura della pandemia che ha evidentemente rallentato tanto questo lavoro come ogni altra attività di ogni tipo in tutto il mondo, tanto che noi pensiamo di poter proseguire ancora per qualche mese il lavoro comune che in ogni caso è stato, verrà detto alla fine di questi giorni di convegno, ma verrà detto in modo migliore di quanto faccia io ora dagli organizzatori, ma insomma si può senz'altro dire che questo lavoro, questo progetto ha lasciato una traccia profonda e importante nell'esistenza della nostra istituzione. Speriamo che ciò valga anche per le altre istituzioni e che sia l'inizio, il primo passo di una collaborazione feconda all'interno della cultura e informazione dell'Europa democratica. Io vi ringrazio e vi saluto augurandovi buon lavoro.
Grazie, professor Carlo Galli.
Grazie professor Galli per il suo saluto introduttivo e per le sue riflessioni che naturalmente non possiamo fare altro che condividere. Buonasera a tutte e a tutti. Comincerò tra pochissimo a parlare in inglese. Vi ricordo, come è già stato ricordato in chat, che potete decidere di ascoltare questo evento sia in italiano che in inglese cliccando sul pulsante dedicato, il pulsante interpretazione con la traduzione simultanea. Vi ricordo anche che sarebbe meglio, laddove possibile, avere una versione aggiornata dell'app di Zoom. Welcome to everyone. Also to those who are slowly logging in now. I will now start speaking in English so we can give the translators a chance to switch languages and to start with their work. Let me just remind you that you can choose the language, so either Italian or English, by clicking on the specific button, possibly with an up-to-date Zoom app. A warm welcome also from Roberto Ventresca and I, who organized this event as scientific responsibles of the project Breaching the Walls, We Do Need Education. The project started in 2019 in the frame of the program Europe for Citizens, and will be concluded at the end of this year of 2021. As Professor Galli was remembering a moment ago, a global pandemic in between has definitely not facilitated the program, but we managed nevertheless to bring it to a conclusion, to almost bring it to a conclusion, because it's not over yet. And I would say very successfully bringing the 6 European partners together and managing to work in a network despite the difficult circumstances. The project did not have from the very beginning an eminently academic profile, as its main purpose was to develop a large reflection on the history and memory of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the events which characterized 1989, involving a broader public of citizens of different countries of Europe. However, we always kept a scientific and historiographical perspective to this project in parallel to its public dimension, and we cared deeply about having these two parts communicate with each other. So we thought of scientific reflections as being essential to proceed with the work on the public level. Let me just say a couple of introductory words about this, about the topic that we chose to deepen and the questions that we wanted to raise. From the very beginning, our idea was to critically reflect on the historical significance and the political impact that the fall of the Berlin Wall generated in Europe and in the countries of the former Soviet bloc. We wanted to analyze this fall both as an event, so as something which happened in a certain moment of time, in a given moment of time, and as a process that is as something having long-term consequences. We also wanted to pay particular attention to the echo that these events had in Italy, and more specifically in the territory of Bologna. Furthermore, we intended to reflect on the legacy that of that experience in the light of subsequent developments of European politics and the EU integration process, in the attempt to investigate the gap between the promises, hopes, and expectations, especially from the side of the populations in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989, and today's reality, which instead often, not always, but often testifies to the spread of critical feelings towards the project of European integration, the EU institutions, its representatives, and its very reasons of existence. I will not get too deeply into this, as we will have the chance today and tomorrow to deepen all these topics with our guests. As for now, it is our pleasure to introduce our first guest, who will delight us tonight with his keynote lecture, and namely Kiran Klaus Patel. A warm welcome from our side. Kiran Patel is professor at the Ludwig Maximilian Universität in Munich, in Germany. We asked him whether he could present some reflections on 1989 as a year in which several processes intersected with each other historically, and in particular, whether he could deepen the connections between the so-called German question and European integration. But I won't say anything else for the moment, and I will just hand over to Roberto Ventresca, who will introduce our guest.
Well, many thanks, Teresa, for the very detailed presentation of both the Breaching the Walls event and today's conference. And I also wish to thank all who contributed to the setting up and the organization of these 2 days conference. So first and foremost, the staff of the Fondazione Gramsci Emilia-Romagna, and of course, Professor Carlo Galli for his opening address. As Teresa has already noticed, today's opening lecture is conceived as a very meaningful step in our common reflection on the manifold issues and topics upon which our own project has been built and unfolded over the last 2 years, a year and a half, more or less. Just a few words on the structure of today's event. After the end of Professor Patel's speech, I and Teresa will briefly discuss his paper and comment on some of the main historiographic issues that will be tackled during his speech. Then we will ask Kiran to reply to our comments, and then we will open the floor to you all, so the participants in the conference. So in this respect, keep in mind that you can pose your question in the chat bar, both in English and in Italian, and then I and Teresa will manage to translate it for Kiran if need be. So let me thank and introduce our today's guest and keynote speaker. Many thanks, Kiran, for being with us today. Kiran Klaus Patel is Professor of European History at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, and is also the Director of Project House Europe, which is a research project which aims at promoting a sort of interdisciplinary reconstruction of European history since 1918. Before moving to Munich, Kiran Patel taught European and global history at Maastricht University. He was a joint chair at the European University Institute in Florence between 2007 and 2011, and he also worked as assistant professor at Humboldt University in Berlin, 2002-2007. He has been visiting professor and fellow in several universities and international research institutes, just to name a few: the EHSS in Paris, Harvard University, Sciences Po Paris, the Oxford University, and the London School of Economics. And of course, he has extensively published on topics concerning the global and transnational history of both Europe, mainly Western Europe, I should say, and the US. And among his latest publications, let me mention The New Deal, A Global History, published by Princeton University Press in 2016, which has been translated into Italian by Einaudi in 2018 with the same title, so Il New Deal, Una Storia Globale. A book edited with Sandrine Cott entitled Nazism Across Borders, The Social Policies of the Third Reich and Their Global Appeal by Oxford University Press 2018. And finally, Project Europe, A History, which came out with Cambridge University Press 2020, but first was published in Germany by Beck Publishing House in 2018. And today, as Teresa has already anticipated, Kiran will give a paper titled 1989, The German Question and European Integration. So to say, Kiran, you are the very right man in the right place, and I'm very glad to give you the floor.
Thank you very much indeed to both Teresa and Roberto. And buonasera, I should probably say, again, having lived in Florence for some time, so it's not pomeriggio anymore, at least not in Florence. And in Munich, I don't know what it is here, where I am. I will try to share my screen with you, if that's all right, because I've prepared a little presentation to substantiate what I'm trying to say. I hope you can see the presentation now. And I'm also trying to speak slowly. Me lo dica se sto parlando troppo velocemente, please, because that is always a danger with me. Now, 1989 is a moment in world history in which several processes intersected: German unification, global trends, European processes, and also especially the process of European integration. Now, I was asked to assess them, particularly the German and the European threats in their interplay, which I'm very happy to do with you tonight, and I look forward to discussion. I think, again, they need to be positioned at the intersection between the stuttering transformation processes in Eastern and in Western Europe alike, along then with a surprisingly quick and new dynamics, leading to a new constellation that, however, was far from the triumph that was long associated with 1989. So here you briefly see a little bit the image of that. And with that, I would like to start with the German side. Obviously, the German question had always been a formative feature of the Cold War conundrum. In the transition from the first to the second half of the 1940s, it was one of the most challenging issues in the post-war planning period and in the slow transition and establishment of the post-war order, with 4 zones of occupation and ultimately a divided country with 2 separate but only partly sovereign states. Obviously, the Federal Republic, soon to be firmly anchored in the Western camp, and the German Democratic Republic in the Eastern Bloc. However, with the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961 and other developments in Germany and beyond, the Cold War turned into a rather static constellation in Europe from the early 1960s onwards. Its most dynamic and most violent parts unfolded in what was at the time called the Third World, or what we now tend to call the Global South. That also allowed for new dynamisms, which have long been overlooked, particularly for the East, an issue to which I will return later. Now, if I say that there is a stabilization, I'm not saying that the German question was solved. It was contained, I would argue, in the context of a rather brutal form of stabilization. And Ostpolitik, Wandel durch Annäherung, all these changes of détente clearly mattered, as détente did overall. Still, as late as 1988, I would argue, very few believed, internationally and in the 2 German states, that unification would be possible in their own lifetimes. Germany also has to be seen in the wider context of 1989, and we have to remember also the chronological context there. The first half of the 80s, and that is sometimes maybe today forgotten, was a period of increased Cold War tensions after a longer period of détente. Think of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, martial law in Poland, SDI, Star Wars, if you will, and many other dimensions. Hence, the end of the Cold War was all the more surprising for everybody, particularly if you say, for instance, see this from the perspective of 1984 or so. And Germany obviously was not the real pacemaker in that process. It was rather developments in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, the key role of Poland, of Hungary, and other places. And it was always, however, clear to observers next to decisions in Moscow and to some extent also in Washington, German developments would be key in the next steps. Why? Mainly because of the size and the importance of the country. Then, of course, also because of the long and problematic history of Germany as the unsettled core of Europe. And also, of course, because German division would also pose other questions for the other states along the Cold War divide. And because, of course, also closely connected to that, because both the Federal Republic and the GDR had a special status in their respective camps. Hence, one could argue 9 November turned into this iconic date for the end of the Cold War, even if, and I find that quite important, other walls had fallen prior to the Berlin Wall, and also other fences had been breached and broken earlier. Hungary, for instance, started to dismantle parts of the Iron Curtain as early as May or June 1989. And in this context, the so-called Pan-European picnic of August 1989 at the Gold border between Hungary and Austria deserves, for instance, mention. So these are all events that are known to experts, but they did not become as iconic as the fall of the Berlin Wall. So in that sense, it shows again that Germany mattered because of the division of Germany as a key symbol of the Cold War. But I think as historians and also looking back, we need to also put it in that wider context and distance ourselves also from the triumphalist narratives that are associated with the Berlin moment only. So in that sense, I see my job as a German historian also to decenter, if you will, the German narrative about the end of the Cold War. And this for various reasons, and I don't have the time to elaborate on all of them, but also because Eastern Europe, prior to 1989, was not an isolated world region that only entered the global stage with, again, the end of the Cold War. It was highly dynamic and also in closer connection with other parts of the world than we have thought for a long period. There is new good research that shows these global links of the Eastern camp with other parts of the world. And hence, there was also no full rupture then with the end of the Cold War, also not in Germany and even less so in other Eastern European countries, with elites, old ones and new ones, older ones who had given up their Marxist orthodoxies, along also with a new dissident intelligentsia that was not sucked into power positions, that also were important in managing at least parts of the transition, at least in the short run. And these new dynamics were challenging for everybody. And there come the short-term factors into the play that I was mentioning before. And Professor Galli already mentioned the question also of the perception of people on the ground. And I think that is an important dimension that we should not forget about this, because this was very clearly a period of unprepared and massive change for everybody involved, a period of acceleration in which, to bring in a little bit of more philosophical approaches to thinking about history, existing experience could no longer predetermine the horizons of expectations. There is this German historian by the name of Reinhard Koselleck who's thought about this and who's argued that basically it's a modern condition that these two spaces fall apart. But if there is one moment for which this is particularly right, I would argue, it's this moment of 1989, again, not only November in 89, when again, what you knew, what you'd experienced so far was no longer a guiding light to what would come in the future. And therefore, the trajectories were then also quite different of what was to come in the future. In the GDR, many, particularly amongst the activists, in the beginning were not really very much in favor of unification, but rather, and particularly amongst the dissidents, were opting and hoping for a third way, for a confederation maybe between the two German states. And few on the 9th of November would have predicted unification, particularly as a process in which then, as we know, Eastern Germany would surrender its own political order and accept the West German Basic Law and lead to an accession, basically, of the eastern part to the western part. So that was very remote from expectations. And I would argue, again, it was remote because Eastern Germany was very much already part of the world and had different ideas, different links to the world that also mattered and impacted on the spaces of experience and the expectations that people actually had. There were other factors more closely connected to diplomatic history, the question whether the Soviet Union would expect that, how also the Western partners would see a united Germany, only to underline again that it was quite unlikely that something as German unification would happen in less than a year's time. But on the other hand, we all know that there was then, in the course of just a few months, a quick consensus being established that due to this being a time of rapid change, this was not to be seen as a time for wild experiments, which again led to a tendency to manage the process through established formats and also by including parts of the established elites. And that, I think, led then and made the way free for unification, which also implied a specific European dimension on which I want to elaborate in the next step, next to the German dynamics and the Cold War dynamics that I've been mentioning so far. And that brings me particularly to the role of the European Union and its predecessors. And here, again, I think we need to remember certain things, and this is just very schematically summarized in this picture, which all of you basically will know, that European integration was in a strange moment when the Cold War ended. My argument, which is not really what you see here, is that basically the European integration process, of course, was already some 4 decades old. But on the other hand, it was still very young at the moment when the Cold War ended. Why? Because I would argue that only since the 1970s and very much also the 1980s, did European integration really start to matter. And it was not very much more than a technical entity of secondary importance until then. It was clearly confined to Western Europe, as we all know, up to that point. And it also helped to decouple, to some extent, in the first half of the 1980s, Europe from the new superpower Cold War dynamics that were kind of unfolding at the period. So in that sense, it was becoming slightly more important in the Cold War context than before, and also trying to ease the relationship between East and West, leading to a new form of rapprochement between the various sides, which, for instance, included secret negotiations between the European Commission and the Kremlin and other dimensions that then also paved a little bit the way for what was to come. And it is interesting that, again, also this process gained momentum as the Cold War receded in the second half of the 1980s. For instance, with the EEC, again, the European Economic Community, and its Eastern pendant, the Comecon, having a joint declaration in 1988 and increasing trade links between East and West. So in that sense, the détente context also facilitated not only the deepening of European integration, but also new links between East and West. And my argument here is that the EC played therefore an important role in the transition process, but that also undergirded the success narrative of the Western model as a successful template for the East. But the point here is also that this was far from clear and a given, that the role that the EC came to play in the late 1980s and into the 1990s was only possible because of processes that were only 10, 15 years old, that it was not long clear that the EC would become such an important player. So if we for a moment allow for the counterfactual and just imagine the Cold War had ended in 1970, I would argue that the EC, the predecessor of today's European Union, would not have played a role to the extent it did at the end of the Cold War, simply because it was still a very technical, small entity, very fragile and more open-ended than we tend to think. To therefore briefly summarize a long and complex process here, I would argue that the European process had an incremental dimension and increased its power slowly since the 1970s. And it is quite important that it then built up new ways of policies, for instance, in the field of monetary integration, that then were ready to play a new role when the Cold War ended. But of course, these were different logics that only came to play together in that very precise moment. The question that we could briefly ask ourselves is why the European integration process plays such an important role. And I will make this very briefly. I would argue that if we take the monetary dimension example, it is quite interesting that it was very important to go for this new form of deepening European integration, particularly since the 1970s. Why? Because you had a common market created since the late 1950s. But in order to uphold that and not jeopardize it once the economy turned bad since the early 1970s, you needed further steps of integration. So in that sense, monetary integration was to some extent necessary to uphold the level of integration already reached. And the second point is because of the strength of the German economy. And that was an effect of the post-war decades, which made the other currencies more dependent upon the Deutschmark. So in that sense, the idea to integrate was more to contain Germany than to give Germany a new power role in this context. So I think it is quite interesting that this was the logic of European integration, which developed very independently of that process of German unification and ending the Cold War, which had its own logic, but that then basically came to a new direction when the Cold War ended. And this is very clear if you look for one moment, because I haven't mentioned actors at all so far for lack of time. At, for instance, Chancellor Kohl in 1989, 890, it was clear for him that German unification would only be acceptable to also the international partners if West Germany and United Germany would be further anchored in the West. And sticking to the example of monetary integration, he felt that this could be a concrete element to do so, also against the resistance of his own experts. So monetary integration had a long trajectory since the 1960s and 70s particularly, but now it was put into a very new intellectual context with German unification to also legitimize such a step and give it a new direction. So this is, I think, a new dimension that we need to understand, that there was a new sense of urgency due to a new global constellation. But I would argue that the Maastricht Treaty and also the creation of the euro would probably have been possible also without German unification and the end of the Cold War. So there is this longer prehistory that matters as much as the end of the Cold War. To take this to one concrete example, and I think one day as a symbol that might also explain some of the problems that we have, that is July 1, 1990, because that is a moment when two quite different processes completely intersected. On the one hand, what we have on 1st of July 1990 is the introduction of the Deutschmark in the GDR. Remember, the Deutschmark was basically the one positive symbol that the Federal Republic had built up. And it was also what, again, made unification so attractive for many people in Eastern Germany. And that is basically the strong symbol of Germany's unification, the introduction of the Deutschmark. But on that very day, the first step of monetary union, which ultimately, of course, would lead to the euro, was also taken. Hence, you have a process where, on the one hand, the national currency was gassed up, if you will, as the new symbol of political unity. And on the other hand, that very symbol was also jeopardized, or at least put on the negotiation table for something else again on the very same day, without, I would argue, people in particularly Eastern Germany being fully aware of what was going on. So what for them was the ultimate goal was at the same time already being up for discussion again. So what you have here is also, again, long-term and short-term processes intersecting with each other. Creating the Europe was a longer arch, basically, an elite-driven process, rather far away from public awareness. And it was then basically intersecting with the short-term process of also introducing the Deutschmark in the GDR, which was a very short-term effect of the crisis of the GDR, and then the wish by many also of the people on the street in Eastern Germany to go to Germany. So again, there were massive discrepancies between experience and expectations, and also divergence of expectations, particularly for people in the GDR, with effects, I would argue, that were disruptive, but only became fully visible somewhat later, when also the tension between these two things became fully clear. And with that, because I was given some 20 minutes, I would already like to come to my conclusion, also to give enough time for the Q&A and the discussion. I think, again, the point is what you have is a process with many unexpected twists and turns, and where we need to be very careful to distinguish these long-term processes from short-term processes, each of which had their very specific logics. But there were mutual dynamics in which each of these processes also impacted on the other and changed them. I have very much focused here on the national and the European level, not so much on the global. That is something we can come back to in the conversation. And with Europe, I've also highlighted one Europe particularly. So this is not a typo here, but rather the Europe of the European Union, because there's also, of course, many other Europes that we could come back to that played a particularly important role in that moment. And again, my argument is that if there is a level of triumphalism about the EU, it's also one that is because of the history that was created at that moment. And in that sense, it was not clear that the European Union would play such a role, but rather it profited from the crisis of an existing order and then using that crisis as a new chance. And this brings me basically to the second point already, that of course the end of German division was not expected. It came as a surprise. And this Europe with a capital U, which of course only formally then started to exist with the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, but I'm using again the institutional Europe here, was then seen as a lever and as an instrument to help solve the German question. So in that sense, it was just a coincidence, a kairos, if you will, where at some specific moment in time, an institutional format proved to be available for something, and then got also energized by playing an important role in that transition period. But again, also with side effects that were then much more detrimental and problematic and only became fully visible afterwards. And that brings me to the third point. I think, again, this shows that there is this intersection between these long-term tendencies in European integration, monetary integration being the best example, that were accelerated by German unification, but led ultimately to these problems that we see in Germany and Europe today. Let me end with just two concrete examples of where the problems really are. I would argue that the very fact that the Deutschmark was also introduced in the former GDR in that moment of transition, so before full unification, but when unification was already en route, while the euro was already negotiated, why to this day, if you look at statistics, support of the European Union in the former GDR parts of Germany continues to be smaller than in the Western parts. And I think that is also part of the effect that, again, people took to the streets, and some of them had very different ideas in the beginning, in fall 1989, but over the months until spring 1989, there was a tendency to go for German unification, but then they got European integration on top, which was not really very much discussed and was a very different future than people really anticipated. The other irony, and this is why I also highlighted the euro, is that over the past years, again, the euro has very often been seen as a means of German domination in Europe. So it's not just a German story that I'm trying to tell here. Now, I was trying to show you very briefly in the short time that I had that the origins of creating the euro were very different, that it was not meant as a means of German power wielding, but rather as a means to rein in, to control German economic power in the 1970s and 80s. And that resistance to create a common currency in Germany was particularly big amongst the elites. So in that sense, it was this moment where also Chancellor Kohl decided that one should give up the currency in order to facilitate German unification through European integration, that we need to see, which shows that the effects long-term have been quite different from that 1989 moment. So in that sense, and with that, I would like to summarize and end. I think, and therefore I very much applaud you, again, Teresa and Roberto, to your project. We need to historicize that moment of 1989 further. We need to also move further beyond the triumphalist arguments, and also need to assess this more critically by also factoring in the perspectives of people on the ground in the various parts of the two Germanys, but obviously also in other member states of the then European communities and today's European Union and beyond, to really come to grips with what is at stake. Again, I didn't have very much time to go into the details, but therefore I'm very glad to first listen to the two comments and then to react to any kind of questions that you might have. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Kiran, for your great keynote, and obviously that's much food for thought for our project and in general on the hint of historicizing 1989. Very thought-provoking points. You dealt with the difficult task of showing the interconnections, these interconnections between processes which come together, but at the same time bear specific characteristics. So that was not easy. In my own research, I have dealt mostly with the history of communism and the history of East Germany. So I will try to focus my comments on those areas more than Europe, because Roberto has worked more on European integration, is an expert in European integration. So there are 3 points in particular which I would gladly hear more about, starting from your interesting presentation. And first, there is an element which you pointed out again and again, and that is that of the German reunification as an unexpected event. So as an event that catches everyone fundamentally unprepared, both in the East and in the West. So you were mentioning Koselleck and the Erwartungshorizont, the horizon of expectation, to emphasize that the experience that existed up to that point, so up to 88, but also up to the summer of 89, so very close to the fall of the Berlin Wall, was not sufficient to foresee the rapid and disruptive developments that led to German reunification. You also mitigated to some extent the emphasis on Ostpolitik and the detente process, so emphasizing the importance of all these elements in the process of rapprochement, above all commercial but also cultural, but at the same time highlighting the fact that, again, both in the East and in the West, very few believed that they would ever see Germany reunified anytime soon. So I would like to ask you if you could elaborate perhaps a little bit more on the alternatives to reunification as they were presented in 88, 89, at the end of the 80s in both East and West. if you could expand a little bit more, perhaps on the third ways that you were talking about before, on the proposals, for instance, for a confederation on the one hand, but also on the other hand, and this from the specific point of view of East Germany, on the proposals for a reformation of real socialism in the GDR into a more reformist socialism with a human face. All proposals which then found little space in post-1990 European Germany. So and there's another question, but maybe that would be too much for today, about the consequences of that. So why do you think they sort of disappeared over time? You also shortly mentioned this point. And the second aspect concerns the criticism that you make to the triumphalist view of the German 89, but also of 89 in general in Central and Eastern Europe. So this triumphalism that often revolves around the date of November 9, 1989, which is known to everyone and to the broader public, let's say, whereas 89 is made of many other small cesuras and watersheds. You mentioned Hungary, you mentioned Austria, but one can certainly add the peaceful revolution, for instance, the Friedliche Revolution in the cities of the GDR. So all processes which are not perhaps as iconic and as visible as the fall of the wall, but are just as important. And again, I would ask you perhaps if you could expand a little bit on this, on these other watersheds related to the German and the East Central European 89. And then I would have a third and last point related to the economic issue. You highlighted the centrality of the 1st of July 1990 as the moment in which the Deutschmark was introduced also in what at that time was still the GDR as a symbol of reunification. And as we know, the economic question was at the heart of the controversies surrounding reunification. For instance, some of its critics have pointed to the economic weakness resulting from what they identify as a sort of imposition of the Deutschmark as an essential feature of what they even called the Anschluss, the annexation of the GDR to the Bundesrepublik, as one of the main reasons for the political and social problems that the former East Germany experienced from the 1990 onwards, and in some ways still today. So that's a highly debated topic, of course, but there is this criticism. And I would like to ask you if you would like to further reflect about these two and tell something more about it, although I'm aware that this could potentially be a never-ending topic. So thank you again from my side.
Excellent, thank you. Roberto, do you want to go first, or should I first take these three questions?
As you prefer. As you prefer.
Whatever you know, you the organizers. I'll do whatever you want.
Maybe I can add my comments, okay, and then you can collect them, and then you reply. And finally, we will open to the floor to discussion. Well, thanks again, Kiran, for your very insightful speech. In your keynote, you refer to manifold layers of analysis from the German question to the global, let's say, 1989 to Cold War dynamics, and of course, European integration. And I'd like to focus on this aspect, so European integration, in order to better understand which role the EC played in the broad picture that you have just sketched out. So, first question. In your, of course, short overview of European integration history, you said that at a certain point, and in particular, starting from the 1970s onwards, something changed. And changed as far as the way, the influence, the role of the EEC international arena was concerned. You mentioned the role played by monetary cooperation and the overall economic logic that stood behind the very setting up of European integration process since the very beginning of its establishment in the Treaty on Rome. All these processes, of course, intersect several dynamics, mainly three, in my opinion. So if we think at policy cooperation within the history of European integration. So the first dimension is the national one, so relationship between member states, EEC member states. The second one is the supranational one, so the EC level of policy cooperation, strictly speaking. And there is a further dimension of policy cooperation, if one thinks at the European integration, which is the relationship between the EC and other international organizations, bodies, from the OECD, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, to the emergence of new actors in the global symmetry, let's think to the G7 from the mid-70s onwards. So my question is, could you tell us a bit more about how and why, in your opinion, the EEC became the main forum, the main theater of policy cooperation within Western Europe? Which is not so, which one must not take for granted if one thinks at the history of European integration. So which were the main regions, the main factors behind the gaining of momentum by the EC in the international dynamics as for Western Europe specifically. Second point, which is somehow related to the first one, you said that, of course, after the 1970s, the 1980s saw the emergence of the so-called global neoliberal turn, the outbreak of the Thatcherite revolution in the UK, Reaganomics in the US, the global and European responses to the challenge of globalization, if you will. And of course, these events had an impact on the way in which the EC evolved during the long, let's say, 1980s. Which finally ended up in the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which was an unexpected phenomenon, as you aptly noticed during your speech. And of course, these events had an impact on the making of the European policy agenda, had an impact as far as, for example, the, let's say, adoption of a neoliberal policy prescription as far as the EC was concerned. A policy prescription which is now the adoption of a neoliberal agenda, which is now questioned by many historians, just to name Laurent Warluset and others. And I think that you as well can be included within those who put into question the equation between 1980s European integration and neoliberalism. But having this big picture in mind, could you tell us a bit more about how the global, if you will, 1989 had impact on the first internal reshaping of the European agenda in the making of the 1989-1992 road to Maastricht, and on the other hand, on the external image, the external agenda, the external policy prescriptions that, especially after 1989 and 1992, the European economic community aimed at spreading at a global level. Especially if one thinks that the relationship that emerged between Western Europe and those Eastern, Central and Eastern European countries, where the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the USSR left or seemed to leave at least a sort of political vacuum, which had to be filled somehow by someone else. So could you tell us about how the global 1989, the outbreak of the end of Cold War, had an impact on both the internal and external reshaping of the European agenda, which at that time was truly an adult, to quote your vocabulary, global actor. Many thanks.
Excellent. These were great questions. It's a tall order to answer all of them. How much time should I take just to have a rough idea? Because easily one could speak very long, but we probably want to create enough space also for other people to come in. Is it 5 minutes or 10 or 2 or whatever?
I guess you have half an hour.
Okay. All in all, okay.
At largest, and then we already invited everyone, of course, to write their questions in the chat. So please, if you have questions, write them in the chat, and we'll collect.
So 5 to 7 minutes or so would be in order, so that we have enough time for everybody else to come in. Great. Again, Teresa, Roberto, these are great questions. I took notes, so forgive me for not looking into the camera, because I wanted to make sure that I don't forget anything. And I would like to take them one by one. And again, these are very big questions, so please forgive me for being not complete, but trying to highlight some of the ideas that I find important in this context. So again, as Teresa said in her first point, I argue that unification came quite unexpectedly, and there was an important discussion about alternatives. If I want to give you the argument first, I would argue that, again, you have firstly a very big acceleration of time and the perception of many actors at the time that there is hardly any time left and decisions need to be taken quickly, again, to be acting in a window of opportunities. This was also one of the metaphors Reagan used at the time, that was closing quickly, basically. And that therefore there was also an evaporation of alternatives that led then to the way that we tend to see this. But the point is that I would argue that, say, in January 1990, the door and the perspectives and alternatives were still much more open, and there was no obvious way that this should, for the German side, and this was the question, lead to unification. And if you just think of Mikhail Gorbachev for a second, for instance, we will all remember him as a politician who himself did not believe in again, the Soviet Union being dismantled, and again, then the post-Soviet countries becoming Western liberal democracies, but rather he was a reform socialist who believed, again, that there was a better way of socialism. I think what we see is a generation of leaders and younger members of the communist elite that had given up the utopian aspirations that a first and maybe second generation of socialist politicians, and also to some extent wider parts of the population had. But still, the idea to fully surrender this and come out for simply adopting the alternative, the Western model, I think was still somewhat a minority position. The idea was still to go for alternatives. And this, I think, also shaped the discussions at the moment in time. So let me remind you that at the very end of 1989, François Mitterrand, of course, also because France was not particularly keen on having Germany reunified, also because of these fears that Germany would just become too powerful, he, for instance, proposed a confederation of the two German states. So after the Berlin Wall, if we just start there, and we could start much earlier, obviously, the idea of not having one, again, united country, but something different that would also, to some extent, take up some older ideas of Germany's role in Europe with a slightly looser form of political organization that would also make sure that this Germany would not become too powerful, but would also kind of allow for alternatives to the Western model, was even a model that was upheld by some Western key politicians. And it is interesting that, for instance, in March 1990, Václav Havel, as the Czechoslovak president at the time, was also coming out of such a model of that kind. And even a month before, Kohl himself, so the chancellor who is then often single-sidedly associated with the way and the path to German unification, also was coming out positively of this idea in one way or the other. Of course, he early on with his 10 points also paved a certain way that ultimately worked towards unification. But I think it would be bad history if we read everything into that direction, and we have to see the openness of the situation. And it was a very complex conflux of different processes of the Western allies and the Soviet Union allowing for this idea of German unification, people on the streets in the GDR and former GDR also opting for this model that then ultimately led to a draw and again an evaporation of alternatives. So it's a very complex story, but I think the job of the historian in 2021 is again to tell the story also with all the twists and turns and the unexpected dimensions, and not in a too straightforward fashion. And again, this also brings up the second point about triumphalism. Again, not only do we see, I think, the many twists and turns and elements in this process, of which there were many, and I've just highlighted a couple of them, but also I think that we see what the price of this step actually was. There was a moment also in German historiography when, again, unification was by many seen as a positive thing, of which there would still be some side effects, which again, over time would peter out which would lead to a happy new union. I think these days we see the problems much more clearly. Problems, again, that have to do with inner German developments, but also with Germany's role in Europe and the wider world. So in that sense, also there, I think we need to pick up these other threads and see also, again, the problems and the lost perspectives on this process. Ingo Schulze, a famous German intellectual, just received a prize in Dresden earlier this week. And he also made this point about some of the challenges and the ongoing problems with German unification that could be mentioned in this context. Now, in order not to speak for too long, let me already come to the third point, again, with the euro and the Deutschmark and the question of imperialism. Again, I would argue this is a highly complex question. What I would certainly find wrong is any kind of master conspiracy, as if, again, either for German unification or also for European domination, the Europe was invented. I think what we see is a confluence, as I was trying to say, between these long and short-term processes, again, with the irony that, of course, Germany, particularly during the Eurozone crisis of the late 2000s and early 2010s, was then becoming a very strong power player and also imposed austerity policies through the means of the euro on other countries, but that the intention of creating the common currency was fundamentally different, and that there were important, particularly economic elites in Germany that very much hated the idea of monetary integration. There was a big fight, of course, also between different philosophies of how a common currency should look. And what we now have is a mix between various approaches, which also shows that the German model that was first imposed with the Maastricht Treaty has withered away over the past 15 to 20 years and isn't the one that rules the European Union anymore. So in that sense, I could speak long and give a lot of details, but if I need to be short, I think also there we have a lot of twists and turns and paradoxes that, again, the job of the historian is to kind of also unfold and analyze in slight bit of detail. So I think, again, while today some of these processes might appear or look like imperialism, that would be a problematic summary of the past. Roberto, again, I think you were very right in, again, distinguishing between the national and supranational level and also the level of other European institutions and forums at the time. And in the book that you were generous enough to mention, I tried to make an argument of why exactly the European community did become the most important player. The starting point is very simple, but I think we need to bear it in mind, particularly for those of us who might be slightly younger and have particularly experienced the last 10, 20 years where the European Union is a very important political factor. Undoubtedly. And the argument for me as a historian is that, well, yes, of course, today it is for better and for worse, but that was by no means a given. And that it only really started to kick in to play that role since the 1970s and 80s. In the book, I have three arguments, which are slightly complex, I fear, but I'll give them to you in a nutshell. And it's also an argument that is not only that the EU became more important vis-a-vis the member states, but also, as Roberto was already insinuating in his question, vis-a-vis other organizations, because it also wasn't clear that the EC or EU would become more important than the Council of Europe, the OECD, and the others. What are the three arguments? I think, firstly, that this economic spin actually mattered a lot. And I'll make this very brief. The Council of Europe, for instance, is an older organization that had more member states and consists to this day as an independent body. But for instance, it was immediately put in charge with issues such as human rights and cultural policies, issues that are very dear to national elites very often, which made them very reluctant to, again, transfer more powers to the European level. Now, the EC was more a technical issue, doing something in the economy or the other, creating a common market and so on. And hence it was more easy for the elites in that organization to argue for further inroads, also by activating, mobilizing this economistic logic of arguing, well, for instance, we have a common market, now we see environmental problems, we need to also have an environmental policy. And that is just one example of many. I mentioned the other one of creating the euro also because of the challenges to the common market that had been created. So this economistic logic, I think, is quite important. Secondly, I think European law mattered. Again, what we have in the European Union and the community beforehand already is a law that is more muscular than the law of normal international organizations. Again, you might be aware of the new haggle between the European Court of Justice and the Deutsche Bundesverfassungsgericht. Having said that, again, European law goes much further, if we talk about the law of the European Union, than the law of other organizations in breaking national law. And that also gave it a new dynamism. And the third argument that I have is money matters, and that the community, again, for reasons that are complex in the details, but overall it's just a point, had more resources than other organizations, which also helped it to creep into new fields of power, to have this competence creep into other fields. So I would argue that it's these three dynamics that really play an important role. And if you just think about the corona situation at the moment, I think many people are very critical, and also rightly so, about what the European Union is doing. But if you look what the European Union is doing, is that it's trying to create a new role for itself in a field for which it so far has very little powers, and that is health. And how does it do it? Again, by using its monies, not least of all. Law also plays an important role, and the economistic logic of saying, well, look, we'll throw money on the crisis, and that will be our way to approach it, is one that, again, combines the money argument with the economistic logic. So I think one might even find it very clearly today. Now, on the second point, on the 1980s, again, I would argue that neoliberalism doesn't summarize it all. The European community does become more important through concrete moments, such as the Single European Act of 1986-7. And there is a certain liberalizing logic that undergirds political developments. And it is the idea that we need to liberalize and overcome the economic crisis of the time through, again, creating or taking that step from the common to the single market. So that is also something, a reason why Thatcher, for instance, very much pushes for this further step of European integration. So it would be wrong to argue that she was always against further European cooperation and integration processes. But again, that is only one part of what's going on, because what you also have is a very strong common agriculture policy, which continues to be very protectionist at the time, interventionist. So it would be very wrong to fully summarize the European community as neoliberal at the times. There is, I think, as always, a hodgepodge of different approaches, some of which get stronger. I think the liberal impulse does get stronger. And it is also getting stronger exactly at the moment when it can also be applied to Eastern Europe. So in that sense, there is again this conflux of longer trends that in Western Europe, in the European community, both in the Commission, but also amongst important member states, such as the British, you have this idea of opening markets, and bang, all of a sudden, without you doing much, the Cold War ends. And you can impose that logic not only to, again, the existing community, but it's also then turning into a promise for those states of Central Eastern Europe, which then also find this process fascinating, and to whom you want to promise this as a new template for the future. Again, the interesting thing is that also here we need to avoid triumphalism. I would argue that there is a good quantum of people who think in market terms in Eastern and Central Eastern Europe already prior to 89. So it's not just an imposition from West to East. There are very interesting ideas already going on, as recent research, for instance, by Sandrine Cotte and many others have shown. But also that, again, it is a moment which in an ironic way energizes this model of the EC, because now it has almost like a new plane, a field where it can argue that it is exactly the model that is needed to organize a future. And that is not only meant for Central Eastern Europe, but also on a global scale. So what you then have in the 1990s is, again, in the field of neighborhood policies, but also in global commercial discussions, this idea that Europe has a model to offer to the world. And that is the model of the European community / European Union. And I think that is a specific moment that we need to historicize also today, these global aspirations, not only in the sense of reaching out to other parts of the world, but also as an idea of having a new universalism. And what we see now, I think, is how that model is also really crashed, if you will, and showing its inner inconsistencies. Just think about democratic values and democratic backsliding within the communities, and also challenges to that model in various parts of the world. So in that sense, I think also there, in this European context, it is very important to historicize the 1989 and to some extent 1992, if we talk about the Maastricht Treaty moment, to really see how a certain idea of a European model was created at that moment in time, also for very specific reasons that have to do with this conflux of different processes and trends, that today, to us, looks also very different from the world that probably we are all living in. And hence, of course, we don't want to be, righteous and just look back and say, well, they got it wrong. But I think our times help us to ask new questions to the past. And these new questions probably can lead us to new probing answers that, again, would underline the open-endedness of processes as they unfolded some 30 years ago. And I'm sorry, I think I haven't answered all the aspects of your very sophisticated questions, but feel free to come back to them, or maybe others will bring them back to us in a moment.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It was great and complete answers, I would say. I would just ask to the public whether there's questions perhaps coming. Again, may I remind you that you can write them in the chat. We have one by Bruno Settis. So he writes, thanks for this excellent talk. A couple of questions on the economic side, building on the comments by Teresa and Roberto. And the first question is, how would you describe the relation between the different privatization processes that were being brought on by Western European states and the massive one brought on by Treuhandanstalt, especially in the post-socialist period? And the second question is, would it be possible to assess the effect of German reunification on the first post-Maastricht economic crisis, the crisis of the EMS in fall 1992, where the shift of German investments from Western European countries, especially Italy, to East Germany, important in causing the imbalances that triggered the crisis? So you have two other very huge questions.
Excellent. Bruno, thank you very much for these questions. Again, they're great. And I presume, or I know that you will be more qualified than I am to answer them, but I'll try. Again, I think the relationship between these various privatization processes, to be honest, is one of the very interesting research topics that we have now. And there is a very big project going on, for instance, at the Institut für Zeitgeschichte that also relates the various processes that go on under the auspices of this Treuhandanstalt. For those of you less familiar with German history, there was a big public body being set up, basically, that was put in charge of privatizing companies in the former GDR. And it has become a very controversial topic in German contemporary or most recent history, with many also to this day, particularly in the former eastern parts of Germany, arguing that this was a selling out and an imperialistic project, basically. So in that sense, Treuhand is mobilizing many emotions to this day, and rightly so. And I would argue that we're only now in the moment when we have started to gain further access and see the role of various actors in this context. The research hasn't been concluded yet, and therefore it's still ongoing, and for me also difficult to summarize as it goes on. But I would argue that if I read the question correctly, and I hope I do so, what we still should do, and that is just a very general historiographic plea, is not focus on the German case only, or also see the other national cases only. What we have is really, and this is also coming back to an aspect that I think I didn't really react to enough in Roberto's question, a process of globalization going on in which also global companies and firms play an important role. And there is, of course, also Italian, British, and other bidders for companies in the former or then the GDR still, as well as in Poland and elsewhere. So what you have is a new kind of conflux also of economic processes, while we should not underestimate that there had been increasingly strong commercial links already between Eastern and Western Europe in the period prior to that. So Fiat, for instance, had set up shops in the eastern part. And again, these processes had also, again, gained traction since the 1960s and 70s. And what I find important is, again, I was glossing over this rather quickly, that you have this period in the early 1980s with new Cold War tensions and new sanctions, for instance, by the United States against the Soviet Union. There is this whole issue about gas pipelines, for instance, where the Europeans play with the Americans formally, right, and also go for sanctions against the Eastern Bloc, but they do so in a very, very soft way, basically, because they want to keep their commercial links alive. So in that sense, there is also very interesting prehistory of commercial links between East and West in Europe, that precedes the end of the Cold War. And I think where we also need to ask further in how far that, again, is already an interesting starting point for these developments post-89 and into 1990 and so on. So in that sense, my answer is maybe more referring to a research agenda, because I could give you one or two concrete examples, but I think the question that you raise, Bruno, is so much bigger and so much more important that we need to look further into that. And it also has to do with the crisis of IMS in 1992. Of course, there is a dimension of a very specific trajectory with Kohl, of course, first promising that German unification would be easy and on the cheap, and then also realizing quite quickly that this was not the case. For instance, and it's only one example, because the hope that Eastern German economy would be quite competitive and that the transition of that economy would go basically quite well, and that German unification would basically be a great way of opening new markets in the East to West German companies, didn't really materialize to the way or to the extent that both Kohl and also economic leaders had expected. So there is a very clear nexus between German unification, the end of the Cold War, and the crisis of not only member states, but also of the economic model as it unfolded. So also there, I would not want to have sounded triumphalist in, again, the European community superimposing something that then worked well. Again, it didn't. And what we should also see, maybe to only mention that aspect here, that, of course, in that moment, in that period of transition, there were economic helps for the former Eastern Bloc countries, like the FARE program and other financial means. And the idea was also to uphold democratic standards and build new forms of rule of law and democracy in these countries. But my argument would also be that there was more of an insistence on economic reforms along capitalist liberal lines than to really uphold and create new democratic structures. And to some extent, the effect of that prioritizing is also something that we see today, where, again, democratic backsliding is comparably, is something that we see quite a lot in Hungary and Poland, and also beyond these two countries, because there was a prioritization on the economic model compared to the political model. This is, by the way, something that a colleague of mine, Ferenc László, is also writing about at the moment, trying to bring together the most recent past of the history of the European Union since 2004. And I think what we get also by other scholars like Philippe Thiers and others is more and more critical insights into the intersection of also the political and the economic dimensions of, again, these new links between East and West after 1990 and into the 2004 Eastern enlargement.
Thank you. Maybe Costanza Calabretta has a question for Kiran. I'm trying to translate. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Patel. I'm wondering whether, in his opinion, Germany, especially during the 2000s, had gained a role in the European Union. So why, in his opinion, it did happen actually, and which kind of role after the Germany gained in that period, and if this dependent by his economic success in a sense, and or also by his role in pushing forward the integration of Eastern countries within Europe. I'm going to conclude, if in your opinion the problem that were linked to the reunification process have been really overcome or maybe marginalized by the, let's say, triumphalist narrative on the history of reunification that were set up after 1989 and especially in the 2000s.
Thank you very much, Costanza, for the question. And I think it ties in quite well with what Bruno was asking before already, because it takes us to the next moment in time. Again, I think we should remind ourselves that Germany was not seen as a positive model economically. In the 1990s, there were very big problems, and people were talking about the sick man at the Spree, again, the river running through Berlin. So in that sense, there were more problems than answers. And what we have seen in more recent time, a very strong German economy is not what we have in the 1990s and the very early 2000s. So in that sense, also there we need to look into the details. But the question was not just about a modello kind of in that sense, but also kind of if its policies were superimposed on the others. And there I would argue that if we talk about enlargement first and foremost, then of course we have a story that can't be kind of related to Germany only. So I would argue that there were many actors that were pushing for Eastern enlargement also beyond Germany. What do I mean with this? If you will, there is something like a script of European integration that one wanted to include as many as possible. So the idea of widening is part of the DNA of also the story that Europeans in that context of the European community told to themselves. So in that sense, once the Cold War was ending and the Iron Curtain fell, it would have been quite difficult to argue, oh, by the way, we don't want you in. So that is exactly what you see also as discussions at the time. And while there was a good level of reluctance, for instance, in France, in the French capital, French presidents, one after the other, in also accepting Eastern enlargement for fear also that Germany would become too big, the British, for instance, were more open to it because they also hoped that the new member states from further east would be more in sync and in line with their approach to European and international policymaking. I would agree that for Kohl, just to talk about him for 1 second, this was also for him as a historian, a dream that he'd always had. So for him, it was really the completion of his dream of Europe to have these new countries or these countries join as new member states to the European community and the European Union. So in that sense, also there is a very interesting mix. And what we also have is, of course, elites in these countries in Central Eastern Europe very much pushing for these agendas, for a membership. I was mentioning Václav Havel before, who again in 1990 was still standing for a different model, but very soon on, he was also, as many others, arguing, well, no, this is the model we should go to. I have talked about the evaporation of alternatives, and I think this is exactly what we see here. That, for instance, the CSCE, a political organization that, of course, under the name of OACC exists to this day, was playing an important role in the context of the Helsinki process and was also quite important in that moment still, but again, then sidelined very quickly in favor of the European Union. And that shows, I think, some of the tensions there. So I'm just trying to look at the question again. If I hope I try to react to it to some extent. Sono state realmente sperate più. In a nutshell, again, I think what we need also there is to be careful with a triumphalist logic or a logic of German superimposition. I would argue that Germany came to play a very powerful role, but that wasn't really the design of the Maastricht Treaty itself. It was also for unintended consequences and also for the imbalances of European integration as they unfolded. Remember, for instance, that in the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, the idea was still to complement deeper monetary and to some extent economic integration with further political integration. And that really didn't materialize. Now, had that developed in a certain way, there could have also been a way to contain the kind of German power that we then saw really impacting European integration also with an austerity course in the 2010s. So in that sense, I think we need to look into this very much step by step to see where the decisions that ultimately led to a situation as the one in 2000 again, 8-9, and particularly in countries like Greece, but also, of course, affecting Italy to a large extent, when these clicked in. And again, I think it is interesting that the most recent past has again led us to a new twist with, again, Germany quite surprisingly, I would think, accepting the next generation EU budget, which of course is something that, again, the very same chancellor with similar coalition governments hated and would not have done some 10 years earlier. So in that sense, the policy of austerity is also not one that Germany follows to the same extent anymore. And it needs detailed research to understand these shifts and changes, I would think.
Thank you very much, Kiran, for your answer, and thank you to Costanza Calabretta. We just remind that Costanza will be talking tomorrow as a guest of ours, talking about cultures of memory in the afternoon together with Fiammetta Balestracci. So we'll have a chance perhaps to follow up with this discussion. If I may, I don't see any questions at the moment, so I would have a question about well, there is one, sorry, so I'm going first with the question from Federica Mascetti. A question about the date of the 9th of November. For which reason, according to you, its symbolism has involved all the other experiences of dissent or revolutions in the former European Eastern Bloc countries? In Poland, for instance, there isn't today a day in remembrance of the first free elections in that country on 4th of June, 1989.
A very good question. Many thanks, Federica. I think, again, I was trying to give you some arguments already. So if you look at the most general level, it has to do with, again, if you will, which doesn't make any sense, I personally think, the attention often going to the big countries, and that would be Germany there. And again, of course, the vision of Germany, the vision of the city of Berlin was an iconic moment and picture where, again, the overcoming, also in a symbolic way, therefore carried a lot of symbolic weight with it. Whereas, again, Supan, for instance, this pan-European picnic, I think is very important and very interesting, but it's largely forgotten because, again, it wasn't such a symbolically charged kind of place already prior in the Cold War period, and hence also didn't lead to the kind of symbolism afterwards. I think the second point that makes Berlin and the 9 November moment stand out, and I'll leave out all the other dimensions, for instance, in the context of German history, because you might know that the 9th of November is a very problematic and complex date in German history, with the Hitler Putsch in 1923, then 1938, persecution of Jews, and other dates. So in that sense, it has always had a very ambivalent role there. But I think one other thing is that the role of the revolution in some other Central European countries is seen in a more contested way than in Germany. And in Germany, it was seen differently because there was this national pathos also of unification. And there was, of course, also a West German effort to really sell and tell this as a success story. Again, in countries like in Russia, for instance, where, again, the economy went down massively and where we now see new cults of Stalin and many other highly problematic forms of kind of history policies, it is no doubt and no surprise, I would argue, that the moment of revolution and the role of Gorbachev, for instance, is not seen as positively and hence also didn't acquire such a symbolic status because the narratives have gone in a very different direction to the triumphalism that is associated with 1989. Again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that is the right story, but I also think that this story that so much concentrates on November 9, 1989 is problematic for various reasons. Again, one book that I can recommend is the recent volume by Jacobi, by Marx, and by James Mark, now I got the name, and Tobias Rupprecht on 89 in a global context, co-authored by several authors, volume that really thinks about this in a very interesting way. And again, also interesting, again, the argument is quite complex, so I cannot summarize it fully, but I will just highlight one thing by looking at the whole process more from the East than from the West. And I think that already changes the picture quite dramatically. So, and it's a book that I can very much recommend in this context, and that I think goes further than I can do in these few minutes to provide an answer on why 89 has become so symbolic and these other things to a lesser extent.
So I'll take the opportunity to jump in with my question. And we talked about the economic issues before, and now I would like to ask you a question about the constitution, the basic law you mentioned before, the Grundgesetz. And I was wondering which role do you think the Grundgesetz, which was sort of enlarged and applied to the former GDR as well, had in the narrative about the European belonging that Germany, the reunified Germany, has even today?
A very interesting question, but also a tough one. I think, firstly, we need to remind ourselves that the Grundgesetz of 1949 was always considered to be provisional. And again, not the permanent constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany. And the whole idea of German unification is in the Grundgesetz as an idea that that should be the ultimate goal. So even in the Grundgesetz, they had the idea that this is a provisional thing, and hopefully there would at some point be a German unification, and then we'll do the job right and go for a real full-fledged new constitution. And again, also there, it is interesting that also due to this acceleration of time, as I'd like to call it, there is then this idea that this is a default model that helps us to also steer the very unclear situation into a rather safe harbor by, again, as we then see with the 3rd of October 1990, the GDR simply joining the kind of the realm of Grundgesetz and hence also the Federal Republic of Germany. So in that sense, I think it is one of the things that would have come as a complete surprise for most people in, say, December 1989, that this would be the way forward. And again, I think it is also one of the problems to this day that, again, for people in eastern parts of Germany, it can look very easy like an imposition that this Western 1949 model is then basically the rule of the land also for them. So that is a problem there. About the European dimension, I think what we have is something that we also, again, need to remind ourselves of is that, of course, with German unification, 3rd of October 1990, we have another accession that is often forgotten and that is hidden. So this is basically after the processes of enlargement, the first enlargement beyond the Iron Curtain. It's not a new country as a full-fledged member state joining. It's a very specific process whereby through, again, German unification, you have a transgression already of the former Iron Curtain, and hence something that also very much impacts European integration. And I would argue that historians, we haven't really spent a lot of time to look at the intersection between these two processes, how on the one hand, again, through the change not of the legal order in Germany, but simply by the extension and expansion of that legal order to, again, more than several million people further to the east, how that impacts European integration and vice versa. I might say that there's a conference that I'm organizing this September, which tries to look further into this issue. And I think now is a good moment to do so, because for the first time, we're able also to use archival documents to do so. But again, I would hope that in the vein that we've been discussing this so far, with a slightly more critical perspective, that also combines the level of national policy making, of international history, of diplomatic history, but also the economic history dimensions that Bruno, for instance, in his question was bringing in, and taking the role of the European community / European Union seriously, we can arrive at a slightly more nuanced interpretation of what is going on there at the time.
And if I may, I take the advantage of having Kiran with us. Going back to what you said about the emergence of a sort of universalistic approach or model, which was set up by the European Union after 1992. In my opinion, at least rhetorically, European Union, European community has always built its own image and model as it was spread abroad on the combination of the so-called growth and prosperity model. And you also mentioned this formula in your Project Europe book. My question is somehow rhetorical as well, if you will. What happens if growth and prosperity fall down? as it happened in 2007, 2008. So in those cases, what does European Union, in a sense, offer to its citizens, peoples, and also to other countries, regions, and political actors at the global level? How can you historically conceptualize this conundrum, if you will?
Good question. Many thanks, Roberto. I would argue that firstly, it's surprising and strange that we have comparably little research on the concrete economic performance and impact of European integration. And that stands, as you rightly said, in stark contrast to the fact that this was always one of the main selling points of European integration. The other big point is peace. And this is the second most important, again, prosperity and economic growth. And that makes it quite interesting that we have comparable research. And I try to bring together what I was able to in the book that I've written. Again, I would argue, and therefore your question was rhetorical but correct and a good one, I would think, that, of course, that creates a major problem for European integration process. And before going to more recent developments, let me just mention an historical example, and that has to do with 1973, with the accession of the United Kingdom to the then European communities. The argument that I would have is that, again, parts of the reluctance and skepticism vis-à-vis the European project that culminated in Brexit, but had earlier antecedents since the 1970s and before, obviously, can be explained with the very moment when the United Kingdom joined. Why so? Because if you look at the history, the talk also prior to accession in the United Kingdom was, well, we'll join and we will prosper. We all know that the very moment when the United Kingdom, but also Ireland and Denmark joined, was one of economic downturn globally with the end of the Trente Glorieuses. So in that sense, my argument is not that there's a very clear causal link between joining and the economic problems that haunted the United Kingdom in the 1970s and 80s. But what I would argue very strongly is that in people's mind, this association was clearly made and also hinged on the promises that they were given before, that again, all would become better once one would become part of that community. And again, cum grano salis, if you will, one could also extrapolate from there to more recent processes where, again, Greece would be, again, a very good example. One could easily talk about Italy, but also about Central and Eastern European countries. Again, promises that had been made that this would easily lead to an upsurge economically have sometimes turned out quite right. Let's not forget about that. But in many other cases, not. And that, I think, and Italy, and you know much more about this than I do, would be a very important example how that has a very clear impact on people's support and views on European integration. If this promise of economic stability, growth, and prosperity is not really fulfilled, people wonder, well, why should we support this in the first place? And that is a real problem there. And I would argue that rightly so. It is also a problem because I think we need more research on what then the economic impact of European integration actually is. And that, of course, hinges on counterfactual scenarios, which are extremely complex and difficult, because the question is, what would be the alternative, right? And there the question is, would it be simply this fully sovereign nation state? Would it be lighter forms of cooperation, for instance, under the auspices of the OECD or whatever? So it's a very complex question, but I think we need to think harder about this as scholars, also in an interdisciplinary way. And I think citizens have all the right in the world to ask these questions of why this is good for. And I think if you look carefully at opinion polls, it's also very clear how this is a subtext that emerges. And it is interesting there, for instance, if you look at also the peace question, that people always liked European integration and cooperation, but that was not necessarily of the kind that the European community stood for. So if you look at the Eurobarometer questions, for instance, there's the question, are you in favor of European unification? This is a literal quote. But unification, it's almost a little bit like asking people, do you like human rights or are you in favor of peace? Quite difficult to say no, if you will, because it also doesn't say what kind of peace, what kind of human rights, what you have to sacrifice for that, or in this concrete sense, what kind of European unification. Is this necessarily the kind of policies that today, for me, in my life, the European Union, for instance, imposes on me? And I think they're also becoming slightly more honest to each other and being clearer as citizens, as in politics, but also doing the kind of research as historians, as scholars in different fields is something that we need more.
Many thanks, Kiran.
Yes, and it's also very interesting to see the intersections between this top-down level in a way and the bottom-up dimension. So that I think is a really important element that we have to consider. We don't see any further questions, so perhaps we can just deeply thank Kiran for his presence and for the intense, rich and very thought-provoking discussion. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. So thank you very much, and we hope to have you again in the future with the Gramsci Foundation in Bologna, possibly in presence if the circumstances allow it. And it was definitely a great entrance into our final event. Roberto, if you want to add something, perhaps let me just say first that our event continues tomorrow for the whole day. And in the morning, we will have the event with Stefano Bottoni and Francesca De Benedetti. We will be talking about 1989 and its consequences in Central Eastern Europe. So we will have a talk with the both of them at 10 o'clock in the morning. And then in the afternoon, Roberto, if you want to talk a little bit about it, perhaps.
Yeah, in the afternoon, I and Costanza Calabretta, who made a question during our Q&A session, and Fiammetta Balistracci will reflect on 1989, 1990 in Germany, and the building up of public memories of the reunification. So I think that this will be another meaningful step of common reflections on the topics and manifold aspects of our Bridge in the World project. And finally, at 5:30 p.m., there will be a sort of roundtable with all the partners of our European project, which will be coordinated by the representatives of the Fondazione Gramsci Emilia-Romagna, so Matilde Artichieri and Maria Chiara Sbiroli. In a sense, our hope is that today and tomorrow, today's conference will be not an end, actually, but will act as a sort of step towards further research paths, towards the enlargement of our own international relations and international dialogue with partners from both the academia, the public engagement, civil society, and so on and so forth. I think that today we have tried to combine together all these aspects, giving emphasis to the historiographic reflection, scientific reflection on the issues that we have tried to deepen over the last 2 years, I guess. And I just joined Teresa's thanks to Kiran and all the other organizations for this very exciting moment of common reflection. And grazie mille a tutte e a tutti. E direi che diamo appuntamento alla giornata di domani, e ringrazio ancora Kiran Klaus Patel. Thank you, Kiran, for being with us today.
Thank you very much indeed. Also from me, just one last sentence from me again. I enjoyed being with you very much. I would have much enjoyed being with you in Bologna. Also because tomorrow I have a very long day of administration. And I think being with you at your exciting conference would have been a fantastic excuse. So one of the many things that Corona is not making possible. But again, good luck for tomorrow. Thank you very much for having me, also for the very interesting and great questions, and be in touch again soon. Grazie e a presto.
Grazie. And
bye-bye.
Perhaps just on a final note, thank you very much to Francesco Cecchi and Michela Bertozzi, our interpreters, who did a great job. So thank you from our side and from the public as well. Good evening.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao, grazie.
Bye. Ciao.